it shouldn't actually be necessary to place Egypt back in Africa, and yet that's geographically or otherwise. However, the fact that in doing so it's labelled African-centred or Afrocentric demonstrates clearly that ancient Egyptian culture has in many respects become decontextualised. And I say that both as a discipline in how we study it and how we teach it, and also in the way that it's currently presented in schools and perhaps more influentially in the media. Now, my paper this afternoon is concerned with some of the issues surrounding how Kemet is represented in a museum, and it's also going to include a summary of various studies that I've undertaken, which explores people's attitudes in Britain to placing Egypt back in its African context. Now, I'd like to begin by explaining that as somebody who initially trained as a classicist, so that's ancient Greek language, classical archaeology, and then switching over to Greek and Roman Egypt, I've always seen the ancient Egyptians as black Africans, and I use that term deliberately, and I'll come back to it later. Greek and Roman historians always confuse the people of Kemet with the Ethiopians. They seem to use Ethiopia quite often when they're referring to what we would call Egypt. And when they depicted an ancient Egyptian or an African, it was with black skin, afro hair, and a wholly different appearance to themselves. We were talking earlier about this concept of the other. You can see that very clearly on this 6th century BC vase that's made in Athens. On the right-hand side you have a depiction of a Greek or a European. On the left-hand side you have their depiction of an African. And I'd just like to say here, for those of you who know Snowden's work, I disagree. In the Greek period I feel that we have almost kind of stereotypes of Africans. I think that changes very much in the Roman period, and I see these two cultures as very separate. Since 2002, I've been curating and looking after the Egyptian collections at the Fitzwilliam Museum in Cambridge. However, for the past 2 years, I've worked full-time in prison education departments using our collections to teach ancient Egyptian and Egypt from an African perspective and within an African context. And I've been researching people's attitudes towards this idea. I've been looking carefully at variables such as ethnic background, age, level of education, and an important aspect of this work has been considering the impact of including Kemet within the wider context of black history has had on black British, Jamaican, predominantly West African students with whom I mostly work. Now, some of you may be thinking, well, Kemet is African, and if people choose not to see it as African, then so what? I take the view that the role of museums should be to act as agents of change, to challenge people's perspectives and people's opinions, and often stereotypes of cultures with which they have no personal connection. In short, it shouldn't only be people who have a direct connection to Africa or an African heritage who view Egypt as Kemet. I also feel that it's important to acknowledge that Kemet has an important place in contemporary black culture and identity, which is recognised far less here in the UK than it is in the States. During the past 2 years, I've also studied criminology, and I have to say that moving into the social sciences has had a really big impact on how I interpret and look at my core subject area. It's amazing how differently you approach a subject in a research project when you know that the people that you're working with and who you're actually studying, who are participating in your research, are going to read the results. You're very, very careful not to misrepresent them. I've also noticed that disclosing our identity, backgrounds and experiences and how they might impact on our interpretation of cultures, both past and present, isn't standard practice within the field of Egyptology. And yet in the social sciences it's absolutely crucial that you include this information and acknowledge how it might impact and also how it might change your opinion on the results of your research. Now, I said I use the term black African deliberately and with careful thought. And it's here where you start to find a divide. If you ask people were the ancient Egyptians African, the majority will probably say yes, on account of the country's geographical location. However, if you ask in a modern context were the ancient Egyptians black, you'll get a very different response. Now, I apologise to anybody who's present and who is of African descent who does not wish to be associated with the racialised term black, and that includes, out of 1,000 people that I saw over the last 2 years, maybe 30 to 40%. But I'm using it in its modern term here, and also important because it's a question that's asked an awful lot by my students. Now, Skin colour and tone was actually an issue in the ancient world. We know that because we can see it from depictions and paintings. And the very fact that on wall paintings in Egypt, people of Kemet, they depict themselves very differently with lots of different skin colours, different types of hair, because they are Africans. And it's remarkable in that if you compare it to this, which is like a stereotype of a generic African, remember they're not actually deciding whether this is an Ethiopian or an Egyptian, it could be either. We see quite a marked contrast. We also get terms by the Greek and Roman historians used for black in describing African people as well. So I think that's quite important, that we're not looking at a modern issue here, we're actually looking also at one that was obviously apparent in the ancient times. Now, in 2008, I was asked to work on a computer-generated image of Cleopatra for a television documentary, and I agreed to do this only if the producers, Atlantic Productions, would show the Queen as a part African. Now, I'm not the first person to suggest that Cleopatra VII was part African, and I'm not the only person to hold the view that Cleopatra's mother and paternal grandmother were Egyptians, and so Africans. If you express this belief verbally, or in written form, then most people won't respond, apart from perhaps saying, well, I thought she was a Greek. But the minute you reconstruct this and so show something visual, then you get quite a dramatic, and in some cases quite a peculiar response to the work. It's really interesting. We used a statue of Cleopatra on the left-hand side, and the people who were doing the imagery, that almost immediately they've narrowed her nose and actually made her look far more European than she is on the statue. The statue actually has quite a broad nose. So it took quite a lot of phone calls, and I didn't work with them directly, and sort of sending sketches off that various people had done and measuring proportions until we actually got something that was even similar to the statue and what we were aiming for. And the reason they did this was they were using an image on a coin that you can see on the bottom left, rather than the actual statue itself. So that was quite interesting, and you can see how the proportions and the face shape actually changed over a period of about a month in terms of sort of sending backwards and forwards different proportions and also different images and measurements from the original statue. Now, on December the 16th, 2008, the Daily Mail ran an article showing the paler version of the image that you see here, and I'd actually asked the company to make her darker skinned. The piece provoked 229 comments on its web blog, which is actually far more than any other article that day. What provoked the response was this reconstruction showing the Queen with dark skin and braided hair. Now I had a look at the, you can actually see all of them, they're still online on the Daily Mail website. But I selected 4 here that people that were living in Britain, I don't know obviously where they were from originally, but they were people that were living in different parts of the UK. Most of the responses came from the States. Perhaps you won't be surprised to come here. This was one of quite common responses. Cleopatra was the Ptolemy family, a Greek family which practiced incest to keep the blood pure, so it's very impossible that she was a mixed ethnicity. She didn't even speak Egyptian, well, according to the ancient sources she did. She would have looked nothing like that. I don't know how this person knows, but clearly they felt very strongly. We also got responses like this. The ancient Egyptians were, as any historian who has studied accounts of the time will tell you, clearly I haven't, white Caucasian Europeans. Cleopatra was white, possibly with some features. And she wouldn't have been a black African, as the picture tries to suggest. They get worse. I thought the Greek Macedonians that ran Egypt would not marry outside the ruling elite, so how is it possible that Cleopatra was of a mixed ethnicity? It's more likely her Greek blood was undiluted, and last time I looked, Greeks were Europeans. This attempt to Africanise Cleopatra is just more anti-Western, multicultural rubbish. The Greek, and that was exactly how they wrote it, that ruled Egypt, looked down on Egyptian culture and were keen to preserve their distinct Greek culture and protect their separateness. The Greeks rarely adopted Egyptian customs, and when they did, it was for political reasons to make their rule more palatable. As a Ptolemaic historian, I would disagree with that entirely, but again, as somebody commented on the website, it's amazing how many Egyptologists read the Daily Mail. The other side of it, we did get some people saying, yes, of course she was mixed race, of course she was African. But this is quite interesting, and there were quite a lot of good comments. Why are people so caught up with colour? History is the issue here, not the colour of those who were reported in history. Achievements, mistake, knowledge, these are the things we should be asking, not what people may have looked like. What a waste of time, effort and money. It's about time people stop classifying themselves in terms of colour. Perhaps it is, but to many people, colour is actually, or it's an enforced part of their identity. And to actually deny that that is, I think, is quite naive. So, as I say, the majority of comments were like this. There were some more extreme versions coming from the States. If you want to, as I said, they're all still up there on the website. And the reason I actually use this is because the moment you put a piece of visual evidence in front of people, it becomes somehow more real. This is the problem with the media and how people of ancient Kemet are actually portrayed in many films or documentaries. And to me, this is where museums can actually play quite an important role, because we're dealing with visual material culture. And I think it's time that museums actually started to realise that and started to take more responsibility for actually how things are represented. Now, I'm not saying that that's easy by any means. This is a picture of one of our galleries at the Fitzwilliam Museum. And a question I've been asking myself is, it's fine if you're giving a talk, if you're explaining things, but how do you actually replicate presenting a culture in a certain way within a museum gallery? And any museum curator, and there are 3 or 4 of you here, will know that we have problems in terms of how many labels we can fit in a case, information panels. And that may sound like a cop-out, but it's actually quite an important part of planning a gallery. If you take objects out in order to put information in, it's quite a difficult problem. I've also been asking myself, how do we change people's attitudes? And also, how do we avoid tokenism in presenting Kemet to the public? And by tokenism, I mean that anything that has a remotely dark colour to it, you can say, well, that's African, or anything that looks African is actually categorised as a Nubian. We need to be very, very careful. We need to be looking at the culture as a whole. I think the first thing that we can do is acknowledge that, as I said earlier, how we view the world can be influenced by our experiences, our identity, and also our background. And earlier this year, and in fact it's continued at the Centre for African Studies in Cambridge, we had an exhibition of an experiment that we did last November with 2 photographers. One was black British, and the other one was white British. And when we were out in Egypt doing some work on a survey, we visited lots of different sites. And I asked both photographers, we visited them together, to take images that really sort of form their impression of ancient Egypt, what it meant to them. The results were interesting in that one chose to concentrate mainly on statues, and so revealing the identity of the ancient Egyptians as Africans, and the other concentrated on architecture and how tourists interacted with the antiquities. So on the left you've got an example by Andrew Croce, a British photographer, and on the right-hand side an example by Michael Jones, who's a white British photographer. We've also found that exhibitions are a good way to focus people on this question, and one that's going to open on Tuesday for Black History Month called Black to Kemet, again working with Black British photographer who's based in Cambridge, Andrew Croce. The concept is to show images that strongly support the idea that people of ancient Kemet were what we would consider today Black Africans. And I'm running a survey as the exhibition's on to see if it impacts on the attitudes of our visitors. We also have other initiatives that we've been trying to secure and will be available to the public within the next 3 months. The first is a virtual version of our Egyptian galleries, which I'll come to later. We also have on the website already 3 DVDs where we asked Egyptologists questions that were sent in by my students from prison and also by community groups. Quite difficult questions to do with race, and Shamaka was one of the speakers and answered questions on that. We've produced a booklet for the courses that I'm teaching, looking at Egypt as part of Africa, and I'm pleased to say that we're in the process of getting a course accredited on African-centred Egyptology for adult learners. And eventually, once I've managed to draw breath, because I've only been back at work for 2 weeks, the PowerPoint presentations that I'm using in the teaching will also be made available with notes for people.